Okay, thanks. Cheers.
The next submitter is Ngaio Parker, also on the same subject.
Good morning. By way of introduction, my family and I relocated to Christchurch August of last year. And when I was considering moving back to New Zealand after being overseas for almost 30 years, my family and I did a road trip, literally to every major city in New Zealand and a lot of smaller towns. And Christchurch originally was not on the list. And ultimately, we were here for a flight. We spent a couple of days in Christchurch, and Christchurch ended up being the place that we selected of anywhere in the world that we could live. And part of what really attracted us to Christchurch was all of the development, all of the infrastructure that was going on downtown, and the fact that the city was in this interesting journey from a revitalization standpoint and from a redefining what is a city, what is a community, and how do we effectively start with almost a blank slate in many respects. Since being here, it's been interesting because on one hand, we've seen quite a lot of development from the first time we were here, which was 2020, to now. But conversely, too, it's also more apparent a lot of the blight that this situation is creating. And effectively, I'm in this odd position. I'm an executive at a tech company in Australia. I hire a lot of people. I'm expanding my team. I would love to be able to expand my team in New Zealand and ideally bring jobs into Christchurch. I would have a really difficult time, frankly, as an employer, bringing people to a city and would be like, okay, it's a lot better than what it was. You know, there's this revitalization plan, but you go downtown. One hand, you have Riverside Market, and then on the other hand, you've got derelict buildings that look like something out of downtown Detroit. And it's this very odd juxtaposition because effectively what these developers and these landowners are doing is creating an externality tax on myself, other ratepayers, other people living in the city by effectively thinking that land banking is a God-given right, which I would argue is not the case. They are imposing taxes on me. We're losing tourists, we're losing the ability to get conventions, we're losing the ability to get high-value employers into the city. It's also, making it a little more challenging for companies to really want to have their people downtown, where if you're having to walk by, the derelict Ridges building, for instance, or things along those lines, it's not the most comfortable experience. And having lived in Chicago, having spent many years as a consultant traveling all throughout the United States and been to cities where it has been hollowed out due to developers and things like that, like Detroit, Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, etc. This situation is creating a really interesting flashpoint as to whether or not all the work that the council, the developers, and everyone has been doing can potentially be undone by the fact that it's more than 10 years since the earthquake, and we're dealing with a situation that doesn't seem to have any end in sight. So for me, it's really important that we need to make it painful. Like 4 times rates, that's not enough because of all the opportunity costs, the additional costs that these developers are imposing on us is not fair. It's just fundamentally not fair. We have health and safety issues. You have homeless people moving into the buildings. You've got risk of further building collapse if and when there is another earthquake. There's also the risk of increased policing. There's also the decrease in property values for all the buildings associated in the surrounding areas. And that's impacting me as a ratepayer because I should be able to see that tax revenue to subsidize everything. And at the end of the day, my family and I are now potentially paying disproportionately higher. But that's across all of Christchurch in that respect. The other thing, too, is some of the developers definitely seem like they have plans and things are in motion if there is an actual plan, if progress is being made, I do not have an issue with maintaining the rates for that. It's the individuals at this point where there is no concrete plan, there is no willingness to actually consider. And at this point, I'd almost strongly consider the council to consider eminent domain, because this is impeding the overall revitalization of this city. And it's fantastic. I'm trying to convince my siblings to move back to New Zealand, and I'd love them to come to Christchurch. I'd love my cousins to move down here because they're primarily up in Auckland and they don't like it. But it's a really, really hard sell for me when I take people downtown. And, you know, on one hand, we have Ngaio across the street, which is one of my favorite restaurants with my husband and I to go to on date nights. But then on the other hand, if, you know, we're walking past, you know, buildings that look like they should be in Grand Theft Auto, it's really hard. So that's my perspective.
Thank you very much. I know that James has got his hand up, but we've come to the end of the time for questions. So thank you very much for your submission today. The next one is